Welcome to today's episode of Ancient Mysteries Unveiled, where we journey back through time to uncover the secrets that history has forgotten. Picture this. You're standing in the shadow of Stonehenge, those massive stones towering above you like ancient sentinels. The guidebook tells you this monument is 5,000 years old, an impressive age that makes it older than the Great Pyramids. But what if I told you that while our ancestors were building Stonehenge, there were already ruins scattered across the world that were older than the stones themselves? What if civilizations had risen and fallen, built temples that reached toward the heavens, developed complex societies, and created art that would make modern artists weep, all thousands of years before the first stone was ever placed at Stonehenge? What if everything we thought we knew about the dawn of human civilization was just the tip of an enormous iceberg? Today, we're about to embark on an extraordinary journey that will take us to forgotten cities buried beneath Turkish hills, to the world's first temples that predate religion as we know it, to settlements so ancient that they witnessed the very birth of agriculture itself. These are the civilizations that time forgot, the true pioneers of human society who laid the patea, foundation for everything that came after. Prepare to have your understanding of human history completely transformed as we uncover the forgotten first civilizations that existed long before Stonehenge ever cast its shadow across Salisbury Plain. Chapter 1. The Pioneer Awakening. The morning mist clings to the ancient hills of southeastern Turkey as the sun rises over what appears to be empty grassland. To the untrained eye, there's nothing here but rolling countryside dotted with the occasional sheep. But beneath your feet lies a secret that has been hidden for over 11,000 years. A secret that fundamentally changed our understanding of human civilization forever. In 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt arrived at this unremarkable hill near the Turkish city of Şanlıurfa. Previous surveys had dismissed the site as a medieval cemetery, but Schmidt saw something extraordinary. As his team began to dig, massive T-shaped stone pillars emerged from the earth, each one carefully carved and positioned with a precision that seemed impossible for the time period the radiocarbon dating suggested. What they had discovered was Göbekli Tepe, quite literally the belly hill in Turkish, and it would completely rewrite the story of human civilization. This wasn't just another ancient site. This was the world's oldest known temple complex, built around 9600 BCE, making it over 6,000 years older than Stonehenge and thousands of years older than agriculture as we know it. To put this in perspective, Göbekli Tepe was already ancient when the people who built Stonehenge were still learning to use stone tools effectively. The builders of this Turkish marvel created their masterpiece at a time when most of humanity still lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers, following animal herds across vast landscapes and living in temporary shelters. Yet somehow, these people managed to quarry, carve, transport, and erect massive limestone pillars that weigh up to 20 tons each. The engineering feat is staggering. Without metal tools, wheeled vehicles, or beasts of burden, these prehistoric builders used only stone hammers and flint blades to create architectural marvels. The T-shaped pillars, some soaring over 16 feet into the sky, are arranged in circular enclosures that demonstrate an understanding of geometry and planning that archaeologists previously thought impossible for the time period. But the true mystery of Göbekli Tepe lies not just in its age or construction, but in its purpose. Unlike later civilizations that built temples after establishing farming communities, the builders of Göbekli Tepe appear to have created this religious complex before they had learned to grow crops. This discovery turned the traditional understanding of human development completely upside down. The prevailing theory had always been simple and logical. Humans learned to farm. Farming created food surpluses. Surpluses allowed specialization, and specialization led to complex societies that could then build monuments. But Göbekli Tepe suggests the reverse might be true. that the desire to create sacred spaces and gather for religious purposes actually drove humans to develop agriculture and settle down permanently. Each pillar at Göbekli Tepe tells a story through its intricate carvings. Wild animals dominate the imagery. Lions, foxes, gazelles, snakes, and scorpions prowl across the stone surfaces in bas-relief sculptures that demonstrate remarkable artistic skill. These aren't just decorative. They appear to represent a complex mythology and belief system that governed the lives of these ancient people. Some pillars even seem to represent human forms, with carved arms, hands, and items of clothing visible on their surfaces. These anthropomorphic pillars suggest that the builders may have believed the stones themselves were divine beings or ancestors watching over their community. Recent research has revealed that Göbekli Tepe wasn't built all at once. Instead, it was constructed and rebuilt over a period of more than 1,500 years, with each generation deliberately burying the previous temples and building new ones on top. This pattern of intentional burial and reconstruction suggests a complex religious practice that we're only beginning to understand. The implications of Göbekli Tepe extend far beyond archaeology. If these hunter-gatherers could organize the massive labor force needed to build such a complex, it suggests levels of social organization and cooperation that we never imagined possible for pre-agricultural societies. The construction would have required hundreds of workers, all needing to be fed, housed, and coordinated, a logistical challenge that would be difficult even today. Perhaps most remarkably, there's no evidence that anyone actually lived at Göbekli Tepe permanently. No cooking hearths, no houses, no domestic waste has been found within the complex. Instead, it appears to have been a pilgrimage site where people travel from great distances to participate in religious ceremonies and communal feasts before returning to their scattered settlements. This discovery has forced archaeologists to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the Neolithic Revolution, that crucial period when humans transitioned from hunting and gathering to farming and permanent settlement. Rather than agriculture driving the development of complex society, Göbekli Tepe suggests that the human desire to gather, worship, and create meaning together may have been the real catalyst for civilization. The site's influence extended far beyond its immediate location. Similar T-shaped pillars and architectural features have been found at sites across the region, suggesting that Göbekli Tepe was the center of a vast network of related communities. It was like a prehistoric cathedral, drawing pilgrims from hundreds of miles away and influencing the development of dozens of smaller settlements throughout what is now southeastern Turkey and northern Syria. As we stand at Göbekli Tepe today, protected by a modern shelter, we're looking at more than just ancient stones. We're seeing the birthplace of organized religion, the genesis of monumental architecture, and quite possibly the spark that ignited the entire Neolithic revolution that transformed humanity forever. Chapter 2. The Temple Builders of the Dawn. The wind whispers across the barren hilltops of southeastern Turkey, carrying with it the echoes of voices that sang hymns over 11,000 years ago. Here, scattered across a landscape that seems empty to modern eyes, lie the remains of the world's first temple builders, people who fundamentally changed what it meant to be human. Göbekli Tepe may be the most famous of these ancient sites, but it was far from alone. Recent discoveries have revealed that it was part of a vast network of stone circles and temples that stretched across the region like a prehistoric spiritual highway. Sites like Karahan Tepe, Navalikori, and dozens of others dot the landscape, each one adding pieces to a puzzle that reveals the birth of organized religion and communal worship. At Karahan Tepe, about 20 miles east of Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists have uncovered what may be an even more sophisticated complex. Here, the builders carved chambers directly into the bedrock, creating underground sanctuaries that feel like entering another world. One chamber contains 11 giant stone phalluses, alongside a mysterious figure with a serpentine body, imagery that speaks to fertility cults and creation myths that we can barely begin to understand. The sophistication of these early temple builders becomes more apparent with each excavation. They weren't simply stacking stones. They were creating complex architectural systems that demonstrate advanced understanding of engineering, astronomy, and artistic design. The circular enclosures at these sites followed geometric patterns based on equilateral triangles, suggesting that the builders used rope and primitive measuring tools to achieve mathematical precision in their layouts. Recent analysis using computer modeling has revealed that many of these temple complexes were planned as unified projects from the beginning, not random additions built over time. The builders would stretch ropes to create perfect geometric shapes, then position their massive stone pillars to align with these predetermined patterns. This level of planning required a sophisticated understanding of mathematics and geometry that we previously did not think existed until thousands of years later. The artistry displayed at these sites is equally remarkable. The animal carvings aren't crude prehistoric scratchings. They're sophisticated sculptures that capture motion, emotion, and character with startling realism. A fox frozen mid-hunt, a lion's muscles tensed for attack, birds with wings spread in flight. These images reveal artists with extraordinary skill and deep understanding of animal behavior. But perhaps most intriguingly, the imagery at these early temples seems to tell stories. The carvings aren't random collections of animals. They appear to represent complex mythological narratives. Vultures feature prominently, often depicted carrying human heads or positioned near headless human figures. This imagery may represent beliefs about death and the afterlife, suggesting that these ancient people had developed sophisticated religious concepts about the soul's journey after death. The builders of these temples also demonstrated remarkable knowledge of astronomy. Many of the stone circles are aligned with significant celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, and the rising and setting of important star groups. Pillar 43 at Tugakli Tepe, known as the Vulture Stone, may actually be a star map showing the constellation positions at the time of construction. If this interpretation is correct, it would make it the world's oldest known astronomical recording. This astronomical knowledge served practical purposes beyond religious ceremony. These temple builders lived during a period of dramatic climate change as the last ice age ended and global temperatures rose. The ability to track seasonal changes through star movements would have been crucial for timing migrations, predicting weather patterns, and coordinating the early agricultural experiments that were beginning to emerge. The scale of organization required for these temple complexes is staggering to contemplate. Each site would have required hundreds of workers over multiple generations. The largest pillars at Göbekli Tepe weigh up to 50 tons. Moving them even with modern equipment would be challenging. Yet these people managed it using only human muscle power, rope, and ingenious engineering techniques. Experimental archaeology has shown that moving one of these massive pillars would have required coordinated teams of 200 to 500 people. Feeding and housing such a large workforce, even temporarily, would have strained the resources of hunter-gatherer communities. This suggests that the temple projects brought together multiple groups from across the region, creating the first large-scale cooperative ventures in human history. The religious practices at these sites remain largely mysterious, but tantalizing clues survive. Large quantities of animal bones found at the site suggest massive feasting events where hundreds of people would gather to share ritual meals. The bones come from wild animals, gazelles, aurochs, wild boar, indicating that these were still hunter-gatherer societies, the ones capable of organizing spectacular communal hunts and celebrations. Stone vessels found at the sites show traces of psychoactive compounds, suggesting that the temple rituals may have involved the use of mind-altering substances to achieve religious ecstasy. Combined with the powerful acoustic properties of the stone circles, which would have amplified chanting and music, These temples were designed to create profound spiritual experiences for their visitors. The deliberate burial of these temples after centuries of use remains one of their most puzzling aspects. Rather than allowing them to decay naturally, the builders systematically covered each complex with thousands of tons of earth and rubble. This wasn't abandonment. It was a purposeful ritual act that suggests these sites were considered too sacred to simply walk away from. Some archaeologists believe this burial pattern represents a fundamental shift in religious thinking. As the climate stabilized and agriculture became more established, the chaotic, animal-focused spirituality of the hunter-gatherer temples may have given way to more organized, domesticated forms of religion centered around farming and fertility. The legacy of these temple builders extends far beyond their immediate region. The techniques they developed, stone carving, architectural planning, astronomical observation, spread throughout the Fertile Crescent and beyond. Their descendants would go on to build the first cities, invent writing, and create the foundations of civilization as we know it. But perhaps their greatest contribution was conceptual. These early temple builders proved that humans could cooperate on massive scales to create something beyond mere survival. They demonstrated that people would invest enormous time and energy to build monuments to their beliefs, their gods, and their understanding of the cosmos. In doing so, they created the template for every religious building, every monument, and every work of communal art that would follow for the next 11,000 years. Chapter 3. The Birth of the Sacred City. 9,000 years ago, in the windswept hills of central Turkey, something unprecedented was happening. For the first time in human history, people were choosing to live permanently together in large numbers, creating what we now recognize as the world's first true city. This place was Çatalhöyük, and its story reveals how humanity took its first tentative steps from scattered settlements toward the urban civilizations that would eventually dominate our world. Imagine approaching Çatalhöyük in 7000 BCE. You wouldn't see individual buildings scattered across the landscape, as we might expect. Instead, you'd encounter what appeared to be a single, massive structure, a honeycomb of interconnected houses built so closely together that they shared walls, creating an urban landscape unlike anything that had existed before. There were no streets in Çatalhöyük, no front doors, no public squares. Instead, the residents entered their homes through holes in the roof, climbing down wooden ladders into living spaces that were simultaneously private dwellings and part of a larger urban organism. This unique architecture created a city that was also a building, a settlement that was simultaneously individual and collective. The implications of this design choice were profound. By sharing walls and entering through rooftops, the residents of Çatalhöyük created a defensive system without building walls. Attackers couldn't simply walk through the settlement but would have to climb from roof to roof while exposed to defenders. More importantly, this architecture fostered a sense of community and shared identity that was revolutionary for its time. At its peak, Çatalhöyük housed between 8,000 and 10,000 people, a population density that wouldn't be seen again for thousands of years. These weren't nomadic hunter-gatherers stopping temporarily. These were permanent residents who lived, worked, and died in the same location for over 1,500 years. Archaeological evidence shows continuous occupation and rebuilding on the same site, creating a tell artificial mound that rose over 65 feet above the surrounding plain. The daily life of Çatalhöyük's residents reveals a society in transition. They were among the world's first farmers, cultivating wheat, barley, and lentils in the fertile plains surrounding their city. They domesticated cattle, sheep, and goats, managing herds that provided meat, milk, and materials for clothing. Yet they still hunted wild animals and gathered wild plants, maintaining connections to the hunter-gatherer lifestyle that had sustained humanity for millennia. Inside their houses, the residents of Çatalhöyük created some of the world's first art galleries. Nearly every dwelling contained elaborate wall paintings and sculptures that transformed domestic spaces into sacred environments. Bull heads emerged from walls as three-dimensional sculptures, their horns jutting into living rooms where families cooked, ate, and slept. Paintings depicted hunting scenes, geometric patterns, and mysterious figures that may represent gods, spirits, or ancestors. The most famous artwork from Cataluyuk is a wall painting that appears to show the city itself with a volcanic eruption in the background. If this interpretation is correct, it would be the world's oldest known map and the first artistic representation of a cityscape. The volcano depicted may be Mount Hazen, which towers over the region and was a source of the obsidian that Cataluyuk's craftspeople worked into tools and ornaments. The burial practices at Cataluyuk reveal a society that had developed complex beliefs about death and the afterlife. Instead of burying their dead in separate cemeteries, the residents interred their deceased beneath the floors of their homes, particularly under sleeping platforms and hearths. This practice meant that families literally lived above their ancestors, maintaining an intimate connection between the living and the dead that would influence religious practices for millennia to come. Some burials at Cataluyuk included plastered skulls, human heads that have been carefully removed from bodies, covered with plaster, and painted to recreate the features of the deceased. These artifacts represent some of the earliest known portrait art in human history, suggesting that the residents of Cataluyuk had developed concepts of individual identity and personal remembrance that we might recognize today. The economic life of Cataluyuk was remarkably sophisticated for such an early period. The city became a major center for obsidian trade, taking advantage of volcanic glass deposits from Mount Hazen to create tools that were exported across the region. Cataluyuk craftspeople developed specialized skills in pottery, textile production, and metalworking, creating products that found markets hundreds of miles away. This specialization required new forms of social organization. Unlike hunter-gatherer bands where everyone performed similar tasks, Cataluyuk's residents developed distinct occupations and skills. Some families focused on farming, others on crafts, still others on trade and exchange. This economic differentiation was the beginning of the complex division of labor that characterizes all subsequent civilizations. Archaeological evidence suggests that Cataluyuk was remarkably egalitarian for such an early urban society. Houses were roughly the same size regardless of their location within the city, suggesting minimal social stratification. Both men and women received similar burial goods and nutrition, indicating gender equality that was unusual even by modern standards. There's little evidence of violence or warfare, suggesting that this early city managed to maintain social harmony despite its large population and dense living conditions. The religious life of Cataluyuk centered around goddess worship and fertility cults. Female figurines found throughout the site suggest that women held important spiritual roles, possibly as priestesses or shamans. The famous Mother Goddess figurine, a powerful female figure seated on a throne flanked by leopards while giving birth, represents one of the earliest known artistic representations of divine femininity. The spiritual landscape of Cataluyuk also included powerful animal symbolism. Bulls, leopards, and vultures appear repeatedly in artwork and religious contexts, suggesting that the residents maintained deep connections to the natural world even as they developed urban lifestyles. These animal spirits may have represented forces of nature, fertility, death, and rebirth that the city dwellers sought to understand and control. The decline of Cataluyuk around 6000 BCE remains somewhat mysterious. Climate change may have played a role, as the region became drier and less suitable for agriculture. Social tensions may have developed as the population grew and resources became strained. The residents may have simply outgrown their unique urban model and dispersed to smaller, more manageable settlements throughout the region. But the legacy of Çatalhöyük extends far beyond its physical existence. This ancient city demonstrated that large numbers of people could live together permanently, creating economic, social, and religious systems that supported urban life. The innovations developed here, specialized crafts, long-distance trade, religious art, complex burial practices, would become standard features of all subsequent civilizations. Most importantly, Çatalhöyük proved that cities weren't just collections of buildings, but living organisms that could foster creativity, innovation, and social cooperation on scales never before achieved. The residents of this ancient metropolis created the template for urban life that we still follow today, establishing the fundamental principle that human beings could build better lives by working together than they ever could alone. Chapter 4. The Walls of the First City. Picture the world's oldest continuously inhabited city rising from the desert like a mirage, its walls shimmering in the heat of the Jordan Valley. Welcome to Jericho, where the story of urban fortification begins, and where humanity first learned to build walls not just to keep enemies out, but to keep civilization in. Standing 850 feet below sea level near the Dead Sea, ancient Jericho, known as Tel Sultan, represents one of the most remarkable achievements in early human settlement. While most of the world still lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers around 10,000 years ago, the residents of this desert oasis were already building permanent structures and developing technologies that wouldn't be seen elsewhere for thousands of years. The secret to Jericho's success lay in its location beside the Ain Sultan Spring, one of the most reliable water sources in the region. This perennial spring created a green oasis in an otherwise arid landscape, attracting both animals and the hunter-gatherers who pursued them. What began as a seasonal camping ground for Nachafian people gradually evolved into something unprecedented, a year-round settlement that would grow into the world's first walled city. The Natufians were remarkable people in their own right. Unlike most hunter-gatherer societies, they had begun to experiment with permanent architecture around 12,000 years ago. They built circular huts with stone foundations, crafted elaborate tools from flint and bone, and developed complex burial practices that included the use of personal ornaments and grave goods. Most importantly, they had begun to harvest wild grains systematically, setting the stage for the agricultural revolution that would transform human society. As the last ice age ended around 9600 BCE, global climate changes made permanent settlement more feasible. The younger Dryas period of extreme cold and drought was giving way to the warmer, more stable conditions of the Holocene epoch. The reliable spring at Jericho became even more valuable as surrounding areas experienced unpredictable weather patterns, drawing more people to this stable refuge. By 8000 BCE, the settlement at Jericho had grown large enough to require unprecedented engineering solutions. The residents built the world's first city wall, a massive stone fortification that stood 12 feet high and 6 feet thick, encircling an area of nearly 10 acres. This wasn't a simple stone fence. It was a sophisticated defensive system that represented a revolutionary leap in human cooperation and engineering. The wall itself was impressive enough, but it was accompanied by an even more remarkable structure. A massive stone tower that rose 28 feet above ground level and extended deep into the earth. This tower, with its internal staircase of 22 stone steps, represents the oldest known defensive structure in human history. The engineering required to build it staggers the imagination. Workers had to quarry massive limestone blocks, transport them to the site, and fit them together with precision that would be challenging even today. Recent archaeological analysis has revealed that this tower may have served purposes beyond defense. The staircase leads to the top of the structure, which would have provided commanding views of the surrounding landscape. Some researchers believe it may have functioned as an astronomical observatory, allowing the residents to track seasonal changes and celestial events that were crucial for timing agricultural activities. The construction of Jericho's fortifications required social organization on a scale never before achieved. Moving the massive stones used in the wall and tower would have required coordinated teams of dozens of workers. The planning, logistics, and sustained effort needed for such a project suggest that the residents had developed hierarchical leadership structures and systems of labor organization that were remarkably sophisticated for their time. Inside the walls, Jericho's residents were pioneering urban technologies that would define civilization for millennia to come. They built rectangular houses with carefully planned rooms, courtyards, and storage areas. They developed some of the world's earliest known plaster floors, smooth, lime-based surfaces that were not only practical but beautiful, often painted with red ochre and decorative patterns. The residents of Jericho were also innovators in food production and storage. They had moved beyond simply harvesting wild grains to actively cultivating domesticated varieties of wheat and barley. They built sophisticated granaries and storage facilities that allowed them to maintain food supplies through seasonal variations and periodic droughts. This agricultural surplus was what made their urban lifestyle possible, freeing some residents to specialize in crafts, construction, and trade. One of the most intriguing aspects of Jerican culture was their treatment of the dead. Like their contemporaries at Cataluyuk, they practiced skull removal and plastering, creating some of the world's earliest portrait art. But at Jericho, this practice reached extraordinary levels of sophistication. The plastered skulls were painted with flesh tones and fitted with shells for eyes, creating hauntingly lifelike representations of the deceased. These plastered skulls represent more than just artistic achievement. They reveal complex beliefs about identity, memory, and the relationship between the living and the dead. The residents of Jericho apparently believed that some essential aspect of a person resided in their skull. And by preserving and displaying these artifacts, they maintained connections with ancestors that transcended death. The technology developed at Jericho spread throughout the region, influencing settlements across the Levant and beyond. The techniques of stone masonry, plaster production, and urban planning pioneered here would become standard features of Near Eastern civilization. The model of the walled city, a defensive perimeter protecting a concentrated population engaged in specialized activities, became the template for urban development that continues to this day. Trade networks centered on Jericho extended across hundreds of miles, bringing obsidian from Turkey, shells from the Mediterranean, and minerals from across the region. This early long-distance commerce demonstrated that the city's residents understood that their urban lifestyle required resources from far beyond their immediate environment. They had learned to create value through craft production and trade it for raw materials they could unproduce locally. The original settlement at Jericho was eventually abandoned around 7000 BCE, possibly due to climate change or social upheaval. But the site was repeatedly reoccupied throughout subsequent millennia, with each new population building upon the innovations of their predecessors. The biblical Jericho of Joshua's time was just one layer in this ancient tell that preserves over 10,000 years of continuous human habitation. The legacy of ancient Jericho extends far beyond its impressive archaeological remains. This city proved that human beings could create permanent settlements that were larger, more complex, and more technologically sophisticated than anything achieved by nomadic societies. The residents of Jericho demonstrated that urban life could provide security, prosperity, and cultural development that would be impossible in scattered hunter-gatherer bands. Most importantly, Jericho established the fundamental principle that has driven urban development ever since: that human beings can create artificial environments that are more conducive to civilization than the natural world around them. By building walls, they created not just physical barriers, but psychological ones, defining an inside and an outside, a civilized space and a wild one, a place where human rules prevailed over natural forces. Chapter 5. The Mesopotamian Genesis. In the scorching heat of the Iraqi desert, where temperatures regularly soar above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, lies the cradle of the world's first urban civilization. Here, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, humanity took its greatest leap forward, creating not just cities, but the very concept of civilization itself. This is Mesopotamia, literally between the rivers in Greek, where writing was invented, where the wheel first turned, and where the template for complex society was forged that still governs our world today. The story of Mesopotamian civilization begins around 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, that arc of arable land stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. As the last ice age ended and global temperatures stabilized, this region became a natural laboratory for human innovation. Wild grasses grew in abundance, providing the raw materials for agriculture, while major rivers offered reliable water sources and transportation routes. But it was in southern Mesopotamia, in the land that would become known as Sumer, that the most dramatic transformation occurred. Around 6000 BCE, people began settling permanently in this challenging environment, drawn by the incredible fertility of the river deltas, but forced to develop revolutionary technologies to survive and thrive. The challenge was immense. Unlike the reliable spring at Jericho or the stable climate of Cataluyuk, southern Mesopotamia was a land of extremes. The rivers flooded unpredictably, sometimes devastating settlements with torrential water, other times disappearing entirely during drought years. The temperature swings were brutal, and there were no nearby hills or forests to provide building materials or refuge. Yet these very challenges drove innovations that would transform human civilization. The Mesopotamians became the world's first hydraulic engineers, developing complex irrigation systems that could channel river water across vast distances to transform desert into farmland. They built canals, levees, and reservoirs that required cooperation between multiple communities and sophisticated mathematical planning. The surplus agricultural production created by these irrigation systems supported population densities never before achieved. By 4000 BCE, Mesopotamian settlements were growing into the world's first true cities, with populations in the tens of thousands. Eridu, considered the oldest Sumerian city, was founded around 5400 BCE and continuously inhabited for over 4,000 years, growing from a small farming village into a major urban center. These early Mesopotamian cities were unlike anything that had existed before. They were dominated by massive temple complexes called ziggurats, step pyramid structures that could be seen from miles away across the flat river plains. These weren't just religious buildings. They were economic, political, and social centers that coordinated all aspects of urban life. The largest ziggurat at Ur rose over 100 feet above the surrounding city, its massive bulk constructed from millions of mud bricks baked in the desert sun. Climbing to its summit would have provided a commanding view of irrigation canals stretching to the horizon, agricultural fields laid out in geometric precision, and the bustling urban landscape of workshops, markets, and residential districts that surrounded the temple complex. The religious and economic functions of these ziggurats were intimately connected. The Mesopotamians believed that their gods owned the land and that humans were merely tenant farmers working divine estates. The temples collected taxes in the form of agricultural produce, which they redistributed to craftspeople, merchants, and administrators who didn't work directly in food production. This system created the world's first complex economy, with specialized occupations and social hierarchies that would become standard features of all subsequent civilizations. To manage these complex economic relationships, the Mesopotamians invented writing, one of the most revolutionary technologies in human history. The earliest writing systems, developed around 3200 BCE, were practical tools for recording economic transactions and managing temple resources. Clay tablets covered with cuneiform script documented everything from grain shipments to worker wages to international trade agreements. The invention of writing transformed human society in ways that are difficult to comprehend. For the first time, information could be preserved and transmitted across generations without relying on human memory. Laws could be written down and enforced consistently. Historical events could be recorded for posterity. Complex knowledge could be accumulated and built upon by successive generations of scholars and specialists. The Code of Hammurabi, carved in stone around 1750 BCE, represents one of the earliest known legal systems. Its 282 laws covered everything from property rights to marriage contracts to commercial regulations, creating a framework for social organization that influences legal systems to this day. The famous principle of an eye for an eye originated in this ancient legal code, establishing the concept of proportional justice that remains fundamental to legal thinking. Mesopotamian innovations extended far beyond agriculture and law. They invented the wheel, initially for pottery making but later adapted for transportation and warfare. They developed the first known schools, training scribes in the complex art of cuneiform writing and the mathematical calculations needed for engineering and commerce. They created the world's first libraries, collecting thousands of clay tablets containing literature, religious texts, medical knowledge, and astronomical observations. The Epic of Gilgamesh, composed around 2100 BCE, represents one of humanity's earliest literary masterpieces. This epic poem tells the story of a legendary king's quest for immortality, exploring themes of friendship, mortality, and the meaning of life that remain relevant today. The flood story in Gilgamesh parallels the biblical account of Noah's Ark, suggesting shared cultural memories of catastrophic flooding that may have actually occurred in the region's prehistory. Mesopotamian astronomers made observations that laid the foundation for scientific understanding of the cosmos. They tracked the movements of planets and stars with remarkable precision, developing mathematical systems that could predict celestial events. Their base 60 number system gave us the 60-minute hour and the 360-degree circle, mathematical concepts we still use today. The political innovations of Mesopotamia were equally groundbreaking. These city-states developed the first known forms of representative government, with assemblies of citizens who could make decisions about war, peace, and community affairs. Kings emerged as both military leaders and high priests, but their power was often constrained by religious councils and civic assemblies that provided checks and balances. Trade networks radiating out from Mesopotamian cities connected regions from the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley. Mesopotamian merchants developed some of the world's first commercial law, creating contracts and business partnerships that could function across cultural and linguistic boundaries. They established trading posts in distant lands and developed credit systems that allowed commerce to function without the need to transport heavy precious metals across dangerous routes. The military innovations of Mesopotamia shaped warfare for millennia. They developed the first known armies organized into professional units with specialized weapons and tactics. The Sumerian phalanx, with its disciplined formation of spear-carrying infantry, became the model for military organization throughout the ancient world. They were also among the first to use siege warfare, developing techniques for attacking fortified cities that would dominate military thinking until the invention of gunpowder. Despite their remarkable achievements, the Mesopotamian city-states were constantly at war with each other, competing for water rights, trade routes, and political dominance. This perpetual conflict drove military innovation, but also created instability that would eventually contribute to the region's decline. The legacy of Mesopotamian civilization cannot be overstated. Virtually every aspect of complex society that we take for granted today, from written law to urban planning, from professional armies to international trade, was either invented or perfected in the land between the rivers. The Mesopotamians proved that human beings could create artificial environments of unprecedented complexity, supporting populations and achieving technological sophistication that would have been impossible in simpler societies. Most importantly, Mesopotamia demonstrated that civilization was not just a collection of innovations, but a new way of being human. The residents of these ancient cities thought differently than their nomadic ancestors, seeing themselves as part of vast social organizations that transcended family and tribe. They developed concepts of citizenship, law, and collective responsibility that formed the foundation of political thinking that continues to evolve today. Chapter 6. The Harappan Mystery. In the vast alluvial plains of the Indus River Valley, where Pakistan and northwestern India now stand, once flourished a civilization so advanced and so mysterious that it challenges everything we thought we knew about ancient urban planning and social organization. The Harappan civilization, also known as the Indus Valley Civilization, created cities that wouldn't look out of place in the modern world. Yet they accomplished this feat over 4,000 years ago, leaving behind one of archaeology's greatest puzzles. Imagine walking through the streets of Harappa or Mohenjo-Daro in 2500 BCE. Unlike the chaotic, organic growth of most ancient cities, these settlements were marvels of urban planning that seem almost impossibly modern. The streets were laid out in perfect grids, running north-south and east-west with mathematical precision. The main boulevards were 30 feet wide, broad enough for carts to pass comfortably in both directions, while smaller residential streets maintained consistent 9-foot widths throughout the city. Every house in these ancient metropolises had access to a sophisticated drainage system that would be impressive even by today's standards. Private toilets connected to covered sewers that ran beneath the streets, carrying waste away from residential areas to collection points outside the city walls. Public wells provided fresh water to neighborhoods, while private wells served individual households. Some houses even had sophisticated bathrooms with waterproof floors and private bathing areas. The level of standardization across Harappan cities is remarkable. Bricks were manufactured to precise specifications throughout the civilization, a 4:2:1 ratio that was maintained whether the bricks were made in Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, or any of the hundreds of smaller settlements scattered across the Indus Valley. This standardization suggests a level of centralized planning and quality control that most civilizations didn't achieve until much later periods. The origins of this sophisticated civilization can be traced to sites like Margar in modern-day Pakistan, where agricultural settlements began developing around 7000 BCE. This ancient farming village represents one of the earliest known agricultural sites in South Asia, where people first began domesticating wheat, barley, and cattle. The progression from Margar to the full Harappan cities represents one of the most successful examples of gradual civilizational development in human history. At Margar, archaeologists have found evidence of remarkably advanced practices for such an early period. The residents practiced protodentistry, using flint-tipped drills to treat tooth problems, a medical technique that wouldn't reappear until thousands of years later. They created sophisticated pottery, developed metallurgy, and established trade networks that stretched across the region. As the climate became more favorable and agricultural techniques improved, settlements throughout the Indus Valley grew larger and more complex. By 3300 BCE, the transition to full urban civilization was beginning, with settlements like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro growing into major cities that would anchor a civilization spanning over 1.5 million square kilometers. The Harappan people were master engineers and craftspeople. They developed a system of weights and measures that was standardized across their entire civilization, enabling complex trade and commerce. Their small bronze and stone weights follow a precise mathematical progression, suggesting sophisticated understanding of mathematics and measurement that facilitated long-distance trade. Harappan artisans created some of the finest crafts of the ancient world. Their bronze work was exceptionally advanced, producing tools, weapons, and artistic objects of remarkable quality. The famous dancing girl bronze sculpture from Mohenjo-Daro demonstrates artistic sophistication that rivals classical Greek and Roman work created thousands of years later. Their bead-making industry was so advanced that Harappan beads have been found in Mesopotamian royal tombs, indicating trade relationships that span thousands of miles. The technical skill required to create perfectly spherical beads, with holes drilled through their centers using only primitive tools, represents a level of craftsmanship that required generations of accumulated knowledge and expertise. The agricultural foundation of Harappan civilization was remarkably sophisticated. They developed irrigation systems that could control river flooding and distribute water across vast agricultural areas. They were among the first people to grow cotton and may have invented the technique of cotton textile production that would become one of the world's most important industries. Perhaps most remarkably, the Harappan civilization appears to have been largely peaceful. Unlike their contemporary civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt, there's little evidence of warfare, military fortifications, or weapons designed specifically for combat. The cities show no signs of violent destruction, and artistic depictions of warfare are virtually absent from Harappan art. This peaceful character extends to their social organization. While other ancient civilizations developed clear social hierarchies with royal palaces and monumental temples, Harappan cities show remarkable equality. Houses vary in size but not dramatically, suggesting a more egalitarian society than was typical for ancient urban civilizations. There are no obvious royal residences or structures that clearly indicate extreme concentrations of wealth or power. The mystery deepens when we consider the Harappan writing system. They developed one of the world's earliest writing systems, inscribing symbols on seals, pottery, and other objects. However, despite decades of intensive study by scholars around the world, the Harappan script remains undeciphered. This makes the Harappan civilization unique among major ancient civilizations. We can see their remarkable material achievements, but we cannot read their own accounts of their beliefs, history, or social organization. The undeciphered script adds to the enigmatic quality of Harappan religion and governance. There are no obvious temples or religious monuments, yet thousands of small figurines and artistic objects suggest complex spiritual beliefs. Some scholars believe they worshipped a mother goddess and practiced fertility cults similar to other ancient civilizations. But without readable texts, these interpretations remain speculative. The decline of the Harappan civilization around 1900 BCE is as mysterious as its peaceful character. Unlike many ancient civilizations that fell to conquest or sudden catastrophe, the Harappan cities appear to have gradually declined over several centuries. Some evidence suggests that climate change may have played a role. As the region became drier and the rivers that supported agriculture began to shift their courses, recent archaeological evidence has revealed that some Harappan people migrated eastward as their cities declined, potentially contributing to the development of later Indian civilizations. Genetic studies suggest that modern South Asian populations retain significant ancestry from the Harappan people, meaning that this mysterious civilization lives on in the people of the region today. The legacy of the Harappan civilization challenges many assumptions about ancient urban development. They proved that large-scale urban civilization could develop without apparent military conquest or extreme social inequality. Their emphasis on public health, urban planning, and standardized quality control created cities that were arguably more livable than most urban centers built thousands of years later. Most importantly, the Harappan civilization demonstrated that there were multiple pathways to complex urban society. while Mesopotamians developed writing primarily for administrative purposes, and Egyptians focused on monumental architecture to honor their pharaohs. The Harappans created a civilization that prioritized practical engineering, public health, and economic efficiency over grand displays of power or religious architecture. Chapter 7. The Egyptian Eternal. Along the life-giving waters of the Nile River, in a landscape where green fertility meets endless desert, arose a civilization that would captivate human imagination for over 5,000 years. Ancient Egypt represents one of humanity's most enduring achievements, a society that maintained its essential character for longer than any other civilization in human history, creating monuments that still inspire awe and developing concepts of life, death, and divine kingship that continue to influence our world today. The story of Egyptian civilization begins in the pre-dynastic period, around 6000 BCE, when scattered farming communities along the Nile began developing the technologies and social organizations that would eventually unite into the world's first nation-state. Unlike the unpredictable rivers of Mesopotamia or the monsoon-dependent agriculture of the Indus Valley, the Nile provided a remarkably stable foundation for civilization. Every year, like clockwork, the Nile would flood between July and October, depositing rich black silt across the river valley and creating some of the most fertile agricultural land on Earth. This predictable cycle allowed Egyptian farmers to plan their activities with precision and created agricultural surpluses that could support large populations and complex social structures. The unification of Egypt around 3100 BCE under the legendary pharaoh Menes, possibly the same person as Narmer, represents one of the first examples of large-scale political organization in human history. Unlike Mesopotamia, which remained divided into competing city-states for most of its history, Egypt became a unified kingdom that stretched for over 600 miles along the Nile River, from the Mediterranean Delta to the First Cataract at Aswan. This unification was both a political and religious achievement. The pharaoh wasn't simply a king but a living god, the earthly manifestation of Horus and the son of Ra. This divine kingship created a political system of unprecedented stability, where the pharaoh's authority was not just political but cosmic, maintaining the order of the universe itself. The concept of Ma'at, divine order, truth, and justice, became the philosophical foundation of Egyptian civilization. Ma'at represented the idea that the universe operated according to divine principles of balance and harmony, and that human society should reflect these cosmic truths. This concept influenced Egyptian law, art, religion, and daily life, creating a coherent worldview that sustained the civilization for millennia. Egyptian achievements in architecture and engineering remain among the most impressive in human history. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built around 2580 BCE for the pharaoh Khufu, was the tallest structure ever built by humans and remained so for over 3,800 years. Standing 481 feet tall and containing over 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing between 2.5 and 15 tons, the pyramid represents an engineering feat that would challenge modern construction techniques. The precision of pyramid construction is staggering. The base of the Great Pyramid is leveled to within just 2.1 centimeters, and the sides are aligned to the cardinal directions with an accuracy of 3/60th of a degree. The mathematical knowledge required for such precision suggests that Egyptian engineers had developed sophisticated understanding of geometry, astronomy, and surveying techniques. But the pyramids were more than just impressive monuments. They were religious machines designed to ensure the pharaoh's successful journey to the afterlife. The complex system of chambers, passages, and shafts within the pyramid served specific religious functions, aligning with stars and cosmic forces that the Egyptians believed governed the realm of the dead. The Egyptian obsession with death and the afterlife produced some of the most sophisticated religious and artistic achievements in human history. The process of mummification, perfected over thousands of years, represents one of the earliest examples of scientific methodology applied to preserving human remains. The elaborate techniques developed by Egyptian embalmers were so effective that we can still examine the faces of pharaohs who died over 3,000 years ago. The Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and instructions for navigating the afterlife, reveals the complexity of Egyptian religious thought. The Egyptians developed detailed maps of the underworld, complete with specific directions for avoiding dangers and achieving eternal life. This systematic approach to death and resurrection influenced religious thinking throughout the ancient world and continues to fascinate modern audiences. Egyptian hieroglyphic writing represents one of the world's most beautiful and sophisticated writing systems. Unlike the practical cuneiform of Mesopotamia, hieroglyphs were designed to be both functional and artistic, combining phonetic symbols with pictographic images to create text that were simultaneously literature and art. The Rosetta Stone, discovered in 1799, finally provided the key to deciphering this ancient script, opening up thousands of years of Egyptian history to modern scholars. The administrative achievements of ancient Egypt were equally impressive. The Egyptians developed one of the world's first bureaucratic systems, with specialized officials responsible for taxation, irrigation, construction projects, and foreign trade. The position of vizier, essentially a prime minister, oversaw the complex administration required to govern a kingdom that stretched hundreds of miles and included millions of people. Egyptian medicine advanced far beyond that of other ancient civilizations. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to around 1600 BCE, contains detailed descriptions of surgical procedures, anatomical observations, and medical treatments that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of human physiology. Egyptian physicians performed surgery, set broken bones, and treated diseases using techniques that were remarkably advanced for their time. The role of women in ancient Egypt was surprisingly progressive by ancient standards. Women could own property, initiate divorce proceedings, and run businesses independently. Several women served as pharaohs in their own right, including Hatshepsut, who ruled for over 20 years and commissioned some of the most beautiful temples and monuments in Egyptian history. Egyptian art developed distinctive conventions that remained remarkably consistent for thousands of years. The famous Egyptian artistic style, with figures shown in profile but with shoulders facing forward, wasn't simply primitive technique, but a sophisticated artistic language designed to convey maximum information about the subject being depicted. This artistic system was so effective that it remained virtually unchanged for over 3,000 years. The economic foundation of Egyptian civilization rested on sophisticated agricultural techniques adapted to the Nile's annual flood cycle. Egyptian farmers developed irrigation systems, crop rotation methods, and storage techniques that could support population densities rivaling those of modern agricultural regions. They were among the first people to develop the plow, greatly increasing agricultural productivity. Trade networks centered on Egypt extended throughout the ancient world. Egyptian gold, papyrus, and luxury goods were prized from Mesopotamia to Nubia, while Egyptian merchants imported cedar wood from Lebanon, incense from Somalia, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. The wealth generated by this trade supported the massive construction projects and artistic achievements that made Egypt famous throughout the ancient world. The religious innovations of ancient Egypt profoundly influenced later civilizations. The concept of monotheism, briefly introduced by the pharaoh Akhenaten around 1350 BCE, may have influenced the development of Judaism and other monotheistic religions. Egyptian ideas about resurrection, final judgment, and eternal life appear in various forms in later religious traditions throughout the Mediterranean world. Perhaps most remarkably, Egyptian civilization maintained its essential character for over 3,000 years, longer than any other civilization in human history. While empires rose and fell around it, Egypt continued to build pyramids, worship the same gods, and maintain the same artistic and cultural traditions from the Old Kingdom through the Ptolemaic period. The decline of ancient Egyptian independence came gradually as the civilization was conquered by Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and finally Romans. But even under foreign rule, Egyptian culture continued to influence its conquerors, and many Egyptian religious and artistic traditions survived well into the Christian era. The legacy of ancient Egypt extends far beyond its famous monuments. Egyptian achievements in mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and engineering laid foundations for later scientific development throughout the Mediterranean world. Their concepts of divine kingship, centralized government, and bureaucratic administration influenced political development across North Africa and the Middle East. Most importantly, ancient Egypt demonstrated that human civilization could achieve unprecedented stability and longevity. While other ancient civilizations rose and fell within centuries, Egypt proved that a society based on coherent religious and philosophical principles could maintain its essential character across millennia, creating cultural achievements that continue to inspire and amaze us today. Chapter 8: The Forgotten Giants of the Americas. While Old World civilizations were building their first cities and developing writing systems, an entirely separate story of human achievement was unfolding on the other side of the planet. In the Americas, isolated from the technological and agricultural innovations of Eurasia, indigenous peoples were developing their own sophisticated civilizations that would create some of the most impressive monuments and complex societies in human history. The story begins much earlier than most people realize. Recent archaeological evidence has pushed back the date of human arrival in the Americas to at least 15,000 years ago, and possibly much earlier. These first Americans faced challenges that were unique in human history. They were pioneers in a vast, uninhabited continent with no domesticated animals, no metal tools, and no written languages to guide their development. Despite these constraints, or perhaps because of them, Native American civilizations developed innovations that were uniquely suited to their environment, and in many cases surpassed the achievements of their Old World contemporaries. The civilizations that emerged in the Americas represent one of humanity's greatest experiments in independent cultural development. In the highlands of Peru, the city of Carol represents one of the world's oldest urban centers, dating to around 3500 BCE. Making it contemporaneous with the early pyramids of Egypt and the first cities of Mesopotamia. Located in the harsh desert landscape of Peru's central coast, Carol shouldn't have been able to support a large population. Yet it became a thriving urban center with monumental architecture that rivals anything built in the ancient world. The pyramids at Carol are massive structures that required sophisticated engineering and enormous labor forces to construct. The largest pyramid covers an area of nearly 5 acres and rises over 60 feet above the surrounding desert. These weren't simple piles of earth, but carefully engineered structures with complex internal chambers, sophisticated drainage systems, and astronomical alignments that demonstrate advanced mathematical and architectural knowledge. What makes Carol even more remarkable is that it was built by a civilization that had no wheels, no beasts of burden, and no metal tools. Everything was accomplished through human labor, ingenious engineering, and sophisticated social organization. The city supported a population of several thousand people in one of the world's most challenging environments, creating a model of sustainable urban development that lasted for over 1,000 years. The economic foundation of Carol was based on a unique combination of maritime resources and inland agriculture. The civilization developed sophisticated fishing techniques that could harvest the rich marine resources of the Pacific Ocean, while simultaneously developing irrigation systems that could support agriculture in the desert interior. This dual economy allowed them to support population densities that shouldn't have been possible in such an arid environment. Moving north into Mexico, The Olmec civilization emerged around 1500 BCE as Mesoamerica's first complex society. Often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, the Olmecs developed many of the innovations that would define Central American civilization for the next 3,000 years. They created the first known writing system in the Americas, developed sophisticated calendrical calculations, and built massive ceremonial centers that influenced all subsequent Mesoamerican cultures. The Olmec heads, massive stone sculptures weighing up to 40 tons each, represent some of the most impressive artistic achievements in human history. Carved from single blocks of basalt, quarried dozens of miles from their final locations, these sculptures required engineering techniques that we're still trying to understand. The faces depicted are remarkably individualistic and lifelike, suggesting that they represent portraits of actual Olmec rulers or religious leaders. The Olmec city of La Venta was one of the earliest planned urban centers in the Americas. The entire city was laid out according to precise astronomical alignments, with major structures positioned to mark important celestial events. This integration of urban planning with astronomical observation became a defining characteristic of Mesoamerican civilization and demonstrates sophisticated understanding of both architecture and astronomy. Olmec innovations in agriculture were equally impressive. They developed raised field systems that could maintain agricultural productivity in swampy lowland environments where conventional farming would be impossible. These techniques allowed them to support large populations in regions that other civilizations couldn't effectively utilize, giving them access to rich biodiversity and trade routes that connected highland and lowland environments. The religious and artistic achievements of the Olmecs profoundly influenced all subsequent Mesoamerican civilizations. They developed the concept of the feathered serpent deity that would later become central to Maya and Aztec religion. Their sophisticated understanding of mathematics and astronomy laid the foundation for the remarkable calendrical systems that allowed later civilizations to predict eclipses and other celestial events with extraordinary accuracy. In North America, the Mississippian culture created urban centers that rivaled anything built in contemporary Europe. The city of Cahokia, located near present-day St. Louis, Missouri, was home to between 10,000 and 20,000 people at its peak around 1050 CE, making it larger than London or Paris at the same time period. The centerpiece of Cahokia was Monk's Mound, a massive earthen pyramid that covers 14 acres at its base and rises 100 feet above the surrounding floodplain. This structure contains over 22 million cubic feet of earth, all moved by human labor using only baskets and simple tools. The precision of its construction and the planning required to coordinate such a massive project demonstrate organizational capabilities that match those of any contemporary civilization. Cahokia was the center of a trade network that extended from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Archaeological evidence shows that goods from across North America flowed through the city, including copper from the Great Lakes region, shells from the Gulf Coast, and exotic materials from as far away as the Rocky Mountains. This trade network required sophisticated systems of transportation, communication, and diplomatic relations that connected dozens of different cultural groups across thousands of miles. The urban planning at Cahokia was remarkably sophisticated. The city was laid out according to cardinal directions with a central plaza that could accommodate thousands of people for ceremonial gatherings. Residential areas were organized into neighborhoods, each with its own smaller plazas and ceremonial structures. The entire city was protected by a massive wooden palisade that enclosed the core urban area. The astronomical knowledge of Cahokian astronomers was extraordinarily advanced. They constructed wooden circles called American woodhenge that functioned as precision astronomical instruments for tracking solar and lunar cycles. These structures allowed them to create calendars that were accurate to within days over periods of decades, enabling sophisticated agricultural planning and religious ceremonial scheduling. The social organization of Cahokia was complex and hierarchical, with clear evidence of social stratification and specialized occupations. Elite burials contain elaborate grave goods and evidence of human sacrifice, suggesting that Cahokian society had developed concepts of divine kingship similar to those found in other complex civilizations around the world. In the southwestern United States, the ancestral Puebloan peoples, formerly called the Anasazi, created architectural achievements that seemed to defy the limitations of their desert environment. At sites like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon, they built massive stone structures that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of engineering, astronomy, and sustainable architecture. The great houses of Chaco Canyon were multi-story structures that contained hundreds of rooms and could house thousands of people. These buildings were constructed with precision stonework that rivals the best masonry of the ancient world, using techniques that allowed them to build structures up to 5 stories tall without the use of mortar or metal tools. The Chaconne road system represents one of the most impressive engineering achievements in pre-Columbian America. These roads, some of which are 30 feet wide and run in perfectly straight lines for dozens of miles, connected Chaco Canyon with outlying communities across the Four Corners region. The roads were built with such precision that they maintained their straight-line orientation even when crossing difficult terrain, requiring sophisticated surveying techniques and enormous labor investment. The architectural achievements of Native American civilizations were matched by innovations in agriculture that allowed them to thrive in challenging environments. The Three Sisters agricultural system, corn, beans, and squash grown together, created sustainable agricultural productivity that could support large populations without depleting soil fertility. This system was so effective that it became the foundation for agricultural development across much of North America. The legacy of pre-Columbian American civilizations challenges many assumptions about technological development and cultural achievement. These societies proved that complex urban civilization could develop without domesticated animals, metal tools, or wheeled transportation. They demonstrated that monumental architecture could be achieved through human labor and ingenious engineering rather than technological advantages. Most importantly, American civilizations showed that there were multiple pathways to complex society. While Old World civilizations developed writing, metallurgy, and other technologies that we often consider essential to civilization, American peoples achieved comparable levels of social organization, artistic achievement, and monumental construction through entirely different technological and social innovations. Chapter 9. The Island Innovators in the Azure Waters of the Mediterranean Sea. On the island of Crete arose a civilization so advanced and enigmatic that it seemed to belong to a different world entirely. The Minoans, as archaeologists have named them after the legendary King Minos, created Europe's first advanced civilization and achieved levels of sophistication that wouldn't be seen again in the region for over 1,000 years after their mysterious disappearance. Picture approaching the palace of Knossos around 1600 BCE, sailing across the wine-dark sea that Homer would later immortalize in his epics. As your ship rounds the headland, you would see rising before you a structure unlike anything else in the contemporary world. A massive complex of interconnected buildings spreading across several acres, its walls decorated with vibrant frescoes, depicting dolphins, bulls, and elegant court ladies with elaborate hairstyles. The palace at Knossos wasn't just a royal residence, but an entire urban complex that served as the political, religious, and economic center of Minoan civilization. With over 1,300 rooms connected by a maze of corridors, courtyards, and staircases, it was the largest building in Europe at the time and wouldn't be surpassed in complexity until the Rama period over a millennium later. What makes Minoan civilization So remarkable is that it developed in almost complete isolation from the other advanced civilizations of its time. While Mesopotamians and Egyptians were building their empires on vast river plains with access to extensive trade networks, the Minoans created their sophisticated culture on a relatively small island with limited natural resources. Their achievements represent one of history's most impressive examples of indigenous innovation and adaptation. The Minoans were master mariners and traders who turned their island location from a limitation into an advantage. Their advanced shipbuilding techniques allowed them to create vessels capable of long-distance voyages across the often treacherous Mediterranean. Minoan ships, depicted in frescoes and pottery, were sleek, fast vessels that could outrun pirates and carry valuable cargoes to markets throughout the eastern Mediterranean. This maritime expertise made Crete the center of a trade network that extended from Egypt to the Black Sea. Minoan merchants brought Egyptian gold, Mesopotamian lapis lazuli, and Baltic amber to their island workshops, where skilled craftspeople transformed these raw materials into luxury goods that were prized throughout the ancient world. The wealth generated by this trade supported the palace complexes and artistic achievements that made Minoan civilization famous. The Minoans developed one of the world's most sophisticated urban planning systems. Their cities included advanced sewage systems, paved roads, and multi-story buildings with indoor plumbing that wouldn't be matched in Europe again until the Roman period. The palace at Knossos had running water, flush toilets, and a sophisticated ventilation system that kept the interior cool even during the hot Mediterranean summers. Minoan technology was remarkably advanced for its time. They were among the first people to use the potter's wheel, creating ceramics of extraordinary beauty and technical sophistication. Their Kamaras pottery, with its flowing organic designs and brilliant colors, represents some of the finest ceramic art ever produced. The technical skill required to create these vessels required generations of accumulated knowledge and innovative glazing techniques. The artistic achievements of Minoan civilization reveal a culture that was unique in the ancient world. Unlike the static formal art of Egypt or the violent imagery common in Mesopotamian art, Minoan frescoes depict a world of movement, joy, and natural beauty. The famous dolphin fresco from Knossos shows dolphins leaping through stylized waves, while the Prince of the Lily depicts a young man walking through a garden of flowering plants. Perhaps most remarkably, Minoan art shows little evidence of warfare or military glorification. Unlike their contemporary civilizations, which typically depicted kings as conquering warriors, Minoan art focuses on religious ceremonies, natural scenes, and peaceful activities. This suggests a civilization that achieved prosperity and stability through trade and diplomacy rather than military conquest. The role of women in Minoan society appears to have been remarkably progressive. The famous snake goddess figurines suggest that women held important religious roles, possibly as priestesses or even deities. Frescoes show women participating in religious ceremonies, attending theatrical performances, and even engaging in the dangerous sport of bull leaping alongside men. Bull leaping, depicted in numerous Minoan artworks, represents one of the most intriguing aspects of their culture. Young athletes, both male and female, would vault over charging bulls in elaborate ceremonies that combined religious ritual with athletic performance. This practice required extraordinary skill and courage, and it may have been connected to fertility cults or coming of age, ceremonies that we're only beginning to understand. The Minoans developed one of the earliest writing systems in Europe. Known as Linear A, however, like the Harappan script, Linear A remains undeciphered, adding to the mystery surrounding this ancient civilization. The tablets written in Linear A appear to record administrative information, suggesting a complex bureaucratic system for managing trade. Taxation and palace operations. Religious practices on Crete were centered around nature worship and fertility. Cults that reflected the island's agricultural foundation. Sacred groves, mountain peaks, and caves served as religious sites where Minoans conducted ceremonies to ensure agricultural fertility and divine protection. The famous sacred horns that appear throughout Minoan art may represent the horns of the sacred bull or the peaks of sacred mountains. The architecture of Minoan palaces reveals sophisticated understanding of engineering and environmental design. The buildings were constructed with advanced earthquake-resistant techniques that allowed them to survive in one of the most seismically active regions of the Mediterranean. The complex system of light wells, courtyards, and corridors created natural air conditioning that kept the palaces comfortable year-round. Minoan influence extended far beyond Crete itself. Archaeological evidence shows that Minoan traders and colonists established settlements throughout the Aegean Sea and even on the Greek mainland. The palace at Pylos and other Mycenaean sites show clear Minoan influence in their architecture, art, and religious practices. The mysterious collapse of Minoan civilization around 1450 BCE remains one of archaeology's great puzzles. Some scholars believe that the massive volcanic eruption at Thera, modern Santorini, around 1600 BCE, weakened the civilization and made it vulnerable to conquest by Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland. Others suggest that internal social pressures or climate change may have contributed to the decline. The explosion at Thera was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in recorded history, creating massive tsunamis and ash clouds that would have devastated the eastern Mediterranean. Some scholars believe this catastrophe may have inspired the legend of Atlantis that Plato described in his dialogues. Though this connection remains speculative, whatever caused their decline, the Minoans left a legacy that profoundly influenced subsequent European development. Their artistic techniques, architectural innovations, and maritime technologies were adopted and adapted by the Mycenaeans and later by the classical Greeks. The concept of the labyrinth, central to the myth of the Minotaur, may have originated from the complex floor plan of the palace at Knossos. The Minoan approach to governance also appears to have influenced later Mediterranean civilizations. Unlike the autocratic kingships common in other ancient civilizations, Minoan society seems to have been more decentralized, with power shared between religious authorities, merchant guilds, and administrative councils. This system may have provided a model for the more democratic forms of government that would later develop in classical Greece. The legacy of Minoan civilization extends beyond its direct historical influence. The Minoans demonstrated that complex urban civilization could develop through peaceful trade and cultural exchange rather than military conquest. Their emphasis on artistic beauty, religious ceremony, and harmony with the natural environment created a model of civilization that emphasized human creativity and spiritual development over political power and military dominance. Most importantly, the Minoans proved that geographic isolation doesn't necessarily limit civilizational achievement. On their relatively small island with limited natural resources, they created a civilization that in many ways surpassed the achievements of their contemporaries, who had access to vast territories and abundant raw materials. Their success came through innovation, adaptation, and the skillful exploitation of their maritime environment to create connections with the broader world. Chapter 10. The Forgotten Mothers of Agriculture in the Mist-Shrouded Highlands of Papua New Guinea, where ancient forests cling to steep mountainsides and hidden valleys, cradle secrets spanning millennia. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of one of humanity's most revolutionary achievements. Here, completely independent from the more famous agricultural developments in the Fertile Crescent, indigenous peoples began cultivating plants and transforming landscapes over 7,000 years ago. creating one of the world's earliest agricultural systems and fundamentally changing our understanding of how farming developed across the globe. The story of agriculture in New Guinea challenges everything we thought we knew about the origins of farming. For decades, the conventional narrative placed the birth of agriculture firmly in the Middle East, with the Fertile Crescent serving as the sole cradle of plant domestication. But recent archaeological discoveries in the Wagi Valley and other highland regions of New Guinea have revealed that people were creating sophisticated agricultural systems here at virtually the same time as their counterparts in the Middle East, developing unique techniques and domesticating plants that were entirely different from those being cultivated elsewhere. Picture the Cuck Swamp archaeological site around 7000 BCE, nestled in a valley 5,000 feet above sea level in the rugged highlands of Papua New Guinea. To modern eyes, this might seem like an unlikely place for agricultural innovation. The climate is cool and wet. The terrain is challenging, and the traditional hunter-gatherer lifestyle of the region's inhabitants appeared to offer little incentive for the back-breaking work of farming. Yet it was precisely in this challenging environment that some of humanity's most ingenious agricultural pioneers developed revolutionary farming techniques that are still used today. The people of Highland New Guinea created the world's first known wetland agricultural system, transforming seemingly unusable swampland into highly productive agricultural plots that could support dense populations in an otherwise challenging environment. The archaeological evidence from Cuck Swamp reveals a sophisticated understanding of hydrology and soil management that rivals modern agricultural science. Ancient farmers here dug networks of drainage channels that could control water levels with precision, creating raised planting beds that provided optimal growing conditions for their crops. This system required careful observation of seasonal water patterns, sophisticated planning, and coordinated community labor to construct and maintain. The crops they developed were entirely unique to their region. Instead of the wheat and barley that were being domesticated in the Middle East, New Guinea farmers focused on bananas, sugarcane, and various root crops that were perfectly adapted to their tropical highland environment. The bananas they cultivated were among the world's first domesticated varieties, representing a completely independent development of fruit agriculture that paralleled but was entirely separate from the grain agriculture developing elsewhere. Perhaps most remarkably, these early New Guinea farmers were practicing sustainable agriculture techniques that modern environmental scientists are only now rediscovering. Their wetland farming systems actually improved soil fertility over time, creating rich, productive agricultural land in areas that would otherwise have been marginal for farming. The drainage channels they dug not only controlled water levels, but also created habitats for fish and other aquatic life, essentially developing the world's first aquaculture systems alongside their plant agriculture. The social implications of this agricultural revolution in New Guinea were profound. The ability to produce food surpluses in a challenging environment allowed for population growth and the development of more complex social structures. Archaeological evidence suggests that these early farming communities developed sophisticated systems of land tenure, water rights, and agricultural cooperation that allowed them to maintain their farming systems for thousands of years. The techniques developed in New Guinea spread throughout the Pacific Islands as Austronesian-speaking peoples migrated across the ocean, carrying with them the knowledge of wetland agriculture and crop cultivation that would allow them to successfully colonize islands from Madagascar to Easter Island. This represents one of the most successful agricultural expansions in human history, as these farming techniques were adapted to diverse island environments across the vast Pacific Ocean, moving to another forgotten center of agricultural innovation. The Ethiopian highlands present us with yet another independent development of farming that occurred around the same time as the more famous agricultural origins in the Fertile Crescent. Here, in the challenging mountainous terrain of the Horn of Africa. Indigenous peoples domesticated a completely different suite of crops that would become crucial for food security in Africa and beyond. The most important of these crops was teff, a tiny grain that remains the staple food of Ethiopia today. Teff is remarkably well adapted to the highland environment, capable of growing at altitudes up to 10,000 feet, and resistant to both drought and excessive rainfall. The domestication of teff represents a sophisticated understanding of plant genetics and selective breeding that allowed Ethiopian farmers to transform a wild grass into a highly productive grain crop. Ethiopian farmers also domesticated ensed, known as the false banana, which became one of Africa's most important food security crops. Ensed can be processed into a nutritious starch that can be stored for years without spoiling, providing communities with insurance against famine and crop failure. The cultivation of ensed requires specialized knowledge that has been passed down through generations, including complex fermentation processes that transform the plant into edible food. The coffee plant, one of the world's most important economic crops, was first domesticated in the Ethiopian highlands. Ethiopian farmers developed sophisticated techniques for cultivating, processing, and preparing coffee that spread throughout the Islamic world and eventually to Europe and the Americas. The economic impact of this single crop domestication has been enormous, creating global trade networks and agricultural systems that continue to this day. In the highlands of eastern North America, indigenous peoples were developing their own unique agricultural systems that would prove remarkably successful and sustainable. The Three Sisters agriculture of corn, beans, and squash represents one of the most elegant solutions to the challenges of sustainable farming ever developed. This agricultural system was based on sophisticated understanding of plant ecology and nutrient cycling. Corn provided support for climbing bean plants, while the beans fixed nitrogen in the soil that fed both the corn and squash. The large leaves of squash plants suppressed weeds and retained soil moisture, creating a self-sustaining agricultural ecosystem that could maintain productivity for decades without external inputs. The development of this system required thousands of years of careful observation and experimentation. Indigenous farmers had to selectively breed wild teosinte into productive corn varieties, transform small wild gourds into large, nutritious squash, and domesticate wild beans, all while figuring out how to grow these very different plants together in ways that maximize their mutual benefits. The nutritional wisdom embedded in Three Sisters agriculture is remarkable. Together, corn and beans provide complete protein with all essential amino acids, while squash contributes vitamins and minerals that complement the grain and legume combination. This agricultural system could support large populations with a agricultural system could support large populations with this agricopulations with a healthy, balanced diet without requiring animal protein or imported foods. The sustainable practices developed by these agricultural pioneers often surpassed modern farming techniques in their environmental sensitivity. In the Andes Mountains of South America, indigenous farmers developed terracing systems that could maintain soil fertility and prevent erosion on slopes that would be impossible to farm using conventional techniques. These Andean terraces, some of which are still in use today after thousands of years, represent engineering achievements that rival the great monuments of other ancient civilizations. The construction required moving millions of tons of earth and stone, creating drainage systems that could handle the intense rainfall of the mountain environment, and developing soil management techniques that could maintain fertility at extreme altitudes. The crop diversity maintained by Andean farmers was extraordinary. They cultivated hundreds of varieties of potatoes, quinoa, and other crops, creating agricultural biodiversity that provided insurance against climate variation and crop diseases. This genetic diversity has proven invaluable to modern agriculture, as many of these ancient varieties contain genes that are being used to develop crops resistant to climate change and emerging diseases. The social innovations that accompanied these agricultural developments were equally important. Indigenous farming communities developed sophisticated systems of reciprocal labor exchange, communal land management, and knowledge sharing that allowed them to maintain their agricultural systems across generations. These social technologies were often as important as the agricultural techniques themselves in ensuring the long-term sustainability of their farming systems. The women of these agricultural societies often played crucial roles as plant breeders, seed keepers, and agricultural innovators. In many indigenous cultures, women were responsible for selecting and saving seeds, experimenting with new varieties, and maintaining the botanical knowledge that kept agricultural systems productive and resilient. The legacy of these forgotten mothers of agriculture extends far beyond their immediate impact on their own societies. The crops they domesticated — corn, potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate, coffee, bananas — have become global staples that feed billions of people today. The sustainable farming techniques they developed offer solutions to modern agricultural challenges, including soil erosion, water management, and climate adaptation. Most importantly, these diverse agricultural origins demonstrate that human innovation and problem-solving abilities are universal. In challenging environments around the world, human communities developed sophisticated solutions to the fundamental problem of food production, creating agricultural systems that were perfectly adapted to their local conditions while contributing to the global diversity of crops and farming techniques that continue to sustain humanity today. Chapter 11. The Web of Connection in the Depths of Prehistory. Long before the age of exploration and global trade that we consider the beginning of worldwide commerce, ancient peoples were already weaving networks of connection that spanned continents and crossed seemingly impossible barriers. These forgotten trade routes and cultural exchanges reveal that our ancestors were far more connected, sophisticated, and globally minded than we ever imagined, creating the first truly international civilization thousands of years before the rise of historical empires. Imagine standing on the shores of the Red Sea around 6000 BCE, watching reed boats loaded with precious obsidian blades and shells disappear into the shimmering distance. These weren't simple fishing expeditions, but sophisticated trading ventures that connected the highlands of Ethiopia with the Arabian Peninsula, carrying goods, ideas, and technologies across hundreds of miles of dangerous waters using navigation. Techniques that we're only beginning to understand. Archaeological evidence from sites across the ancient world reveals trade networks of staggering scope and sophistication. Obsidian from Turkish volcanoes has been found in sites across the Middle East, sometimes transported over 1,000 miles from its source. Lapis lazuli from the mountains of Afghanistan appears in Mesopotamian royal tombs and Egyptian jewelry. Shells from the Indian Ocean were crafted into ornaments in European Neolithic sites, while amber from the Baltic Sea found its way to the Mediterranean. These weren't random movements of goods, but systematic trade networks that required sophisticated logistical organization, diplomatic relationships, and shared standards of value that could function across cultural and linguistic boundaries. The scale of these operations suggests that even in prehistory, human societies were developing the commercial and political infrastructure needed for international commerce. The obsidian trade represents perhaps the most impressive of these early networks. Volcanic glass was one of the most valuable materials in the prehistoric world, capable of being shaped into tools sharper than modern surgical steel. The volcanic sources of high-quality obsidian were limited to specific locations, primarily in Turkey, Armenia, and parts of Greece. Yet obsidian tools appear in archaeological sites across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Recent chemical analysis has allowed archaeologists to trace specific obsidian artifacts back to their geological sources, revealing trade routes that crossed mountain ranges, deserts, and seas to connect distant communities. The obsidian trade from Göbekli Tepe's region reached sites over 1,000 miles away, suggesting that the world's first temple complex may also have been a major center of international commerce. The logistics of moving heavy stone materials across such distances required innovations in transportation and organization that we're only beginning to appreciate. Teams of traders would have needed detailed geographical knowledge, diplomatic relationships with intervening communities, and sophisticated planning to coordinate journeys that might take months to complete. But these ancient traders weren't just moving goods. They were carrying ideas, technologies, and cultural practices that would transform societies across the known world. The spread of agricultural techniques, pottery styles, religious concepts, and artistic motifs can be traced along the same routes that carried trade goods, suggesting that commercial contact was driving cultural evolution on a global scale. The development of maritime trade represents one of humanity's greatest technological and organizational achievements. By 7000 BCE, people were already making regular sea voyages across the Mediterranean, carrying pottery, tools, and raw materials between islands and coastal communities. These early mariners developed navigation techniques based on star patterns, wind directions, and seasonal weather patterns that allowed them to cross open ocean with remarkable accuracy. The colonization of Cyprus around 10,000 years ago represents one of the earliest known examples of deliberate ocean crossing. The island lies 40 miles from the nearest mainland, requiring sophisticated boats and navigation skills to reach safely. Archaeological evidence shows that the first Cypriots brought with them domesticated plants and animals, suggesting planned colonization rather than accidental discovery. That the skills developed by these early Mediterranean sailors would eventually enable the even more impressive maritime achievements of later periods, including the Polynesian colonization of the Pacific and the Norse exploration of the North Atlantic. But the foundation for all of these achievements was laid by prehistoric mariners who first learned to read the signs of wind and wave to navigate beyond sight of land. Overland trade routes were equally impressive in their scope and sophistication. The Silk Road that connected China with the Mediterranean is justly famous, but it built upon trade networks that had existed for millennia before. Archaeological evidence shows that jade from China was reaching Central Asian sites over 5,000 years ago, while techniques for bronze working spread from the Middle East to China, along routes that would later become the classical Silk Road. The horse, domesticated on the steppes of Central Asia around 4000 BCE, revolutionized long-distance trade and communication. Horse-mounted traders could cover distances that would have been impossible on foot, carrying valuable lightweight goods like spices, precious metals, and worked artifacts across continental distances. The spread of horseback riding technology itself represents one of the most important cultural exchanges in human history. The development of wheeled vehicles, probably around 3500 BC in Mesopotamia, further revolutionized overland trade. Heavy goods like metals, grain, and pottery could now be transported efficiently across long distances, enabling bulk trade that would support larger populations and more complex manufacturing industries. These transportation innovations didn't just move goods. They carried people, and with them, genes, languages, and cultural practices that created the ethnic and linguistic diversity we see in the world today. Recent genetic studies have revealed migration patterns that closely follow known trade routes, suggesting that commerce and human dispersal were intimately connected throughout. The cultural impacts of these early trade networks were profound and lasting. Religious concepts, artistic styles, and technological innovations spread along commercial routes, creating the first truly international culture. The goddess figures found across Neolithic Europe, the spiral motifs that appear in art from Ireland to Greece, and the shared pottery styles found across vast regions all testify to cultural connections, maintained through trade and exchange. Perhaps most importantly, these trade networks required the development of diplomatic and legal institutions that could function across cultural boundaries. Traders needed safe passage guarantees, standardized measures and currencies, and dispute resolution mechanisms that could work between communities that might speak different languages and follow different customs. The development of writing itself may have been driven partly by the needs of long-distance trade. The earliest cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia are largely economic records, inventories, contracts, and accounts that were needed to manage complex commercial relationships. The spread of literacy often followed trade routes as communities developed writing systems to participate in increasingly complex commercial networks. Money, in various forms, emerged from the need to facilitate trade between communities with different resources and needs. Standardized weights, precious metal currencies, and even primitive banking systems developed to support commercial relationships that spanned continents. These innovations laid the foundation for all subsequent economic development and remain fundamental to modern commercial systems. The environmental impacts of these early trade networks were also significant. The demand for precious materials led to some of the world's first industrial mining operations, while the need to supply traders with food and fodder along their routes led to agricultural intensification in strategic locations. Some scholars argue that prehistoric trade networks may have contributed to deforestation and other environmental changes that affected climate and ecosystem development. The collapse or disruption of these trade networks could have devastating effects on communities that had become dependent on imported goods and materials. Archaeological evidence shows that several ancient civilizations went through periods of decline that correspond to disruptions in long-distance trade, suggesting that global economic integration created vulnerabilities as well as opportunities. The legacy of these prehistoric trade networks extends far beyond their immediate economic impacts. They established the template for global commerce that continues to this day, proving that human beings have always been inclined to connect with distant communities and exchange goods, ideas, and cultural practices across vast distances. Most importantly, these ancient networks demonstrate that globalization is not a modern phenomenon, but a fundamental aspect of human civilization. From the earliest times, human communities have sought to expand their horizons, connect with distant peoples, and participate in larger networks of exchange and cooperation. The forgotten civilizations that created these networks were the true pioneers of international relations, developing the diplomatic, commercial, and technological innovations that made global civilization possible. Their achievements remind us that human ingenuity, curiosity, and cooperation have been connecting our world for thousands of years, longer than we ever imagined. Beyond these macro-level networks, the intimate details of prehistoric trade reveal just how sophisticated these ancient commercial relationships actually were. At the site of Catalyük in Turkey, archaeologists have discovered obsidian tools that originated from 11 different volcanic sources, some located over 1,000 kilometers away. This wasn't random acquisition. The residents showed clear preferences for specific types of obsidian for different purposes, suggesting they understood the subtle differences in quality between sources and had developed standardized criteria for evaluating raw materials. The obsidian workshop areas at Catalyük reveal master craftspeople who had developed specialized techniques for working different types of volcanic glass. They understood that obsidian from Guludak was perfect for making the finest cutting tools, while material from Nenezidak was better suited for everyday implements. This level of discrimination required generations of accumulated knowledge and direct experience with materials from distant sources. Even more remarkably, chemical analysis of obsidian artifacts shows that some pieces were partially worked at their source locations before being transported to their final destinations. This suggests a division of labor that spanned hundreds of miles, with preliminary processing happening near quarry sites and final finishing occurring at consumer locations. Such organization required sophisticated communication between communities and standardized quality control that could function across cultural boundaries. The social implications of these trade relationships were profound. Communities that controlled access to valuable raw materials developed into specialized trading centers with influence far beyond their immediate regions. The site of Xikwi-Hiyuk in Cappadocia, located near major obsidian sources, shows evidence of workshops that were producing far more tools than the local population could possibly use, clearly manufacturing for export to distant markets. These early trading centers developed some of humanity's first service industries. Settlements along major trade routes provided food, lodging, and protection for traveling merchants. They offered specialized services like tool repair, animal care, and guide services for dangerous passage through difficult terrain. Some communities developed reputations for specific types of craftsmanship that drew customers from hundreds of miles away. The demand for exotic materials drove some of the world's first systematic mining operations. At Grimes Graves in England, Neolithic miners dug over 400 shafts to extract high-quality flint, some extending 40 feet underground through solid chalk. These weren't casual gathering expeditions, but organized industrial operations that required specialized tools, knowledge of underground conditions, and coordinated labor teams. The flint mines at Grimes Graves reveal sophisticated understanding of geology and mining engineering. Miners used antler picks to excavate horizontal galleries following seams of the best quality flint. They developed lighting systems using oil lamps, ventilation techniques to provide fresh air underground, and safety protocols to prevent cave-ins. The scale of these operations suggests that hundreds of people were involved in producing flint. Tools for trade across Britain and continental Europe. Maritime trade networks were equally sophisticated in their organization and technology. Archaeological evidence from the Mediterranean reveals that by 7000 BCE, people were making regular voyages between islands, carrying not just small luxury goods, but bulk commodities like pottery, stone tools, and even building materials. The standardization of pottery styles across the Mediterranean during this period suggests regular contact and shared cultural preferences maintained through maritime commerce. The boats used for these early Mediterranean voyages were remarkable. Achievements in naval architecture. Recent experimental archaeology has shown that reed boats, similar to those depicted in ancient art, could carry substantial cargoes across open ocean. These vessels, constructed from bundled papyrus or other plant materials and sealed with natural resins, were lightweight, buoyant, and surprisingly seaworthy. Navigation techniques developed by these early mariners were based on sophisticated understanding of natural phenomena. They learned to read wind patterns, wave formations, and cloud formations that could indicate the presence of land beyond the horizon. They used migrating birds as navigational aids, following species known to fly between specific islands during particular seasons. Star navigation allowed them to maintain course during nighttime voyages and determine their approximate position relative to known landmarks. The colonization of islands throughout the Mediterranean and beyond required not just navigational skill, but careful planning and resource management. Colonists had to carry everything needed to establish permanent settlements: seeds, animals, tools, and enough food to sustain communities until local agriculture could be established. This required boats capable of carrying substantial cargoes and communities capable of organizing complex expeditions. Cyprus provides a particularly striking example of planned colonization. The first settlers arrived around 10,000 years ago, bringing with them domesticated pigs, cattle, and goats, along with seeds for cultivated grains. These animals and plants were not native to Cyprus and had to be deliberately transported from the mainland. The success of this colonization required detailed knowledge of local conditions and careful preparation for the challenges of establishing agriculture in a new environment. The cultural exchange facilitated by these maritime networks transformed societies throughout the Mediterranean. Pottery styles, artistic motifs, and religious symbols spread rapidly between islands and coastal communities. The famous Cycladic figurines found throughout the Greek islands represent a shared artistic tradition that could only have developed through regular contact and cultural exchange maintained by maritime trade. Religious concepts and practices also traveled along these early trade routes. The goddess figures found across Neolithic Europe show remarkable similarities in style and symbolism, despite being separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years. Sacred symbols, ritual objects, and burial practices spread along the same routes that carried trade goods, suggesting that ancient merchants were also carrying religious ideas and spiritual innovations. The spread of metallurgical knowledge represents one of the most important cultural exchanges in human history. The techniques for smelting copper and later bronze required specialized knowledge of ore identification, furnace construction, and alloy composition. These skills spread from their probable origins in Anatolia and the Caucasus along trade routes that eventually reached Britain, Scandinavia, and the Atlantic coast of Europe. The Bronze Age transformation of European society was directly dependent on these long-distance trade networks. 10. Essential for making bronze was available only in a few locations, primarily Cornwall, Brittany, and parts of Central Europe. Copper sources were more widely distributed, but still required long-distance transport to reach many communities. The emergence of bronze technology created new demands for international trade and more sophisticated transportation systems. Amber represents another fascinating example of prehistoric long-distance trade. This fossilized tree resin, prized for its beauty and believed to have magical properties, was found primarily along the Baltic Sea coast, but appears in archaeological sites throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. The Amber Road, connecting northern Europe with the Mediterranean, was one of the most important trade routes of the ancient world, continuing to function for thousands of years. The amber trade reveals the social and cultural significance of these early commercial networks. Amber wasn't just a luxury good, but was believed to have healing properties and spiritual significance. Amber beads and ornaments have been found in the graves of high-status individuals from Britain to Greece, suggesting that access to exotic trade goods was becoming a marker of social rank and political power. The standardization of weights and measures across vast regions provides evidence of the sophisticated commercial institutions that govern prehistoric trade. Archaeological sites across Europe have yielded balance weights that conform to standardized systems, allowing merchants to conduct transactions with confidence across cultural and linguistic boundaries. These systems were so successful that some continued to be used for thousands of years. The development of proto-currencies facilitated increasingly complex commercial relationships. Metal objects like copper rings, bronze axes, and even standardized ingots began to function as stores of value and mediums of exchange. These weren't yet coins in the modern sense, but they served similar functions, allowing traders to conduct business without the need for direct barter of goods. Credit systems and commercial partnerships also emerged from the needs of long-distance trade. Merchants developed relationships of trust that allowed goods to be advanced against future payment, enabling commerce to function despite the time delays inherent in long-distance transportation. Family and tribal networks were extended across hundreds of miles to support commercial relationships and provide security for traveling traders. The role of women in these early trade networks appears to have been more significant than previously recognized. Recent analysis of burial goods and artistic depictions suggests that women often controlled specific types of trade goods, particularly textiles, pottery, and ornamental objects. Women may have served as diplomatic intermediaries between communities, using marriage alliances and kinship networks to facilitate commercial relationships. Textile production and trade represents one of the most important but underappreciated aspects of prehistoric commerce. Plant and animal fibers had to be processed using complex techniques that required specialized knowledge and substantial time investment. The spread of specific textile technologies, like the use of particular dye stuffs or weaving techniques, can be traced along trade routes, revealing networks of knowledge exchange that paralleled the movement of finished goods. The environmental consequences of these early trade networks were more significant than might be expected. The demand for specific materials led to intensive exploitation of certain resources, possibly contributing to local environmental degradation. Forest clearance for fuel to support metalworking operations, overgrazing by animals being driven to market, and erosion caused by increased foot traffic along trade routes all had cumulative effects on ancient landscapes. Some scholars argue that prehistoric trade networks may have contributed to the spread of diseases that affected both humans and domestic animals. Increased contact between previously isolated populations could have facilitated the transmission of pathogens, potentially contributing to demographic changes and cultural disruptions that are visible in the archaeological record. The resilience of these ancient trade networks in the face of natural disasters and cultural disruptions was remarkable. Archaeological evidence shows that many trade routes continued to function despite climate changes, volcanic eruptions, and social upheavals that might have been expected to disrupt long-distance commerce. This suggests that the economic and social institutions supporting trade had become deeply embedded in ancient societies. The collapse of trade networks, when it did occur, could have cascading effects across entire regions. The end of the Bronze Age around 1200 BCE involved the disruption of trade networks throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, contributing to the collapse of several major civilizations. This demonstrates how interconnected the ancient world had become and how dependent societies had grown on long-distance commerce for essential materials and technologies. Recovery from such disruptions often involved the reestablishment of trade networks along slightly different routes or with modified organizational structures. The Iron Age that followed the Bronze Age collapse saw the development of new commercial networks that were in some ways more robust and flexible than their predecessors, building on thousands of years of accumulated experience in long distance trade. The linguistic evidence for prehistoric trade networks is equally fascinating. Common words for trade goods, measurement systems, and commercial practices appear in languages separated by thousands of miles, suggesting shared vocabularies that developed through commercial contact. Some of the oldest Indo-European words that can be reconstructed relate to trade, exchange, and valuable materials. The influence of these ancient trade networks extended far beyond their immediate economic functions. They created the infrastructure, both physical and social, that would support the expansion of later empires and the development of classical civilizations. The roads, harbors, diplomatic protocols, and commercial institutions developed by prehistoric traders provided the foundation for the Mediterranean world of Greece and Rome. Most remarkably, these prehistoric trade networks demonstrate that globalization, the integration of distant communities through commerce, cultural exchange, and shared institutions, is not a modern phenomenon, but one of the defining characteristics of human civilization from its very beginning. Our ancestors were internationally minded, technologically innovative, and culturally sophisticated in ways that continue to shape our world today. As we reach the end of our journey through these forgotten civilizations, we stand at the summit of a mountain of human achievement that stretches back over 12,000 years into our collective past. From the temple builders of Göbekli Tepe to the master planners of the Indus Valley, from the agricultural pioneers of New Guinea to the maritime traders who connected distant continents, we have witnessed the birth of everything that makes us human. These forgotten civilizations were not primitive stepping stones on an inevitable path to modern progress. They were sophisticated, innovative societies that solved complex problems with elegance and ingenuity that often surpasses our own. They proved that there are many ways to build civilization, many paths to complexity, and many definitions of human achievement. The residents of Catalu created urban density without losing community cohesion. The Harappans built cities with better public health systems than many modern municipalities. The Maya developed astronomical calculations more accurate than those used in Europe until the Renaissance. These weren't accidents or isolated achievements. They represent sophisticated understanding of engineering, mathematics, social organization, and human nature. Perhaps most importantly, these civilizations remind us that human beings have always been creative, curious, and capable of remarkable cooperation. The massive stones of Göbekli Tepe weren't moved by alien technology or lost sciences. They were moved by human hands working together toward a common goal. The trade networks that connected prehistoric Europe with Central Asia were maintained by modern communications. They were sustained by human relationships built on trust, mutual benefit, and shared understanding. Today, as we face challenges that require global cooperation and innovative thinking, we can draw inspiration from these ancient pioneers. They face seemingly impossible odds, harsh climates, limited resources, no precedent for the societies they were trying to build. Yet, they succeeded in creating civilizations that lasted for millennia. Their achievements remind us that human potential is limitless when we work together, that innovation comes from necessity and creativity, and that every generation has the power to build something unprecedented. The civilizations that came before Stonehenge didn't just lay the foundation for everything that followed. They proved that human beings are capable of greatness in any age, under any circumstances. The next time you see ancient stones or visit an archaeological site, remember that you're not just looking at ruins. You're seeing evidence of human dreams made real, of impossible projects completed through determination and cooperation, of our ancestors' refusal to accept limitations on what human beings could achieve. These forgotten civilizations may be lost to time, but their legacy lives on in every city we build, every challenge we overcome, and every moment we choose cooperation over conflict. They are the true foundation of human civilization, and their story is our story, still being written, still reaching toward the impossible, still proving that there are no limits to what human beings can accomplish together.